SMB Investor with Nick Bryant and Sean Smith.
Hey everyone, you got Sean Smith here. This is the SMB Investor Podcast. And I'm the founder of SMB Investor Network and managing partner at Search Fund Ventures. Today we're joined by Anthony, who is an expert in business operating systems. He's a Pinnacle implementer. He's not only implemented Pinnacle for many clients, but also has extensive experience implementing EOS and Pinnacle in his own businesses. So, Anthony, thanks so much for joining us.
Sean, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Why don't we start off by, getting a sense for your background and what you do at Higher Peak today. Tell us a little more about all that.
Sure, absolutely. Happy to dive in there, and I'll give you a little bit of kind of how I ended up to where I am now. Really, kind of coming out of college, I had really no idea what I wanted to do. I was a kind of finance major and knew that was kind of a brass ring to reach for, and started working with companies that were owner managed businesses, sometimes multi-generational businesses that were looking to sell their business. And I kept seeing how many of them were multiple times of their competitors or their peers, and just became really interested in what makes certain companies just more valuable, and could see the impact that they were having within their communities, within their industry, within their kind of personal worlds, and the wealth that they were creating and the impact there. And really kind of fell in love with that, and kind of decided, all right, someday I want to be an entrepreneur and do that myself. Got my experience in investment banking, but then really tried to get experience in what does it mean to build a team and to be in charge of a P&L, and learn how to lead people, and eventually kind of felt ready to go try and do that myself. And over the course of, my experience, I had learned about the search fund community, and this was back in like 2010 when it was really just starting, and there wasn't a ton out there, but saw a couple examples of that and really just was so intrigued by that model. And so I set out to do a self-funded search with a good friend of mine from college, and we set out to do that kind of self-funded search. I had been working in healthcare, so I really kind of decided to focus most of my search on healthcare, and specifically within autism therapy. Having kind of grown up with an autistic twin brother, it was something that was really personal to me and that I knew pretty well. And so kind of set out to do that, and ultimately that led me to actually partner with a clinician in Arizona. So moved from Nashville to Arizona to do that. And it was really actually, while I was technically an acquisition, it was really more of a kind of a startup. There were some contracts in place, a few patients, but it was really a startup. And so that's kind of what the start of my entrepreneurial journey was. And through the course of that, I got introduced pretty quickly to a search fund CEO that I really respected and looked up to, named Alex Stavros at Embark Behavioral Health. And I remember like one of the first things that he told me to do was, hey man, you need to get an operating system. And I was like, huh, what is that? I was like, that like Oracle or an ERP or something like that. I kind of didn't know what that meant. And so, I quickly went out and read about that, and read Traction was out back then, and tried to kind of self-implement it at first, and learned, pretty quickly you can do that. You can get some benefit from that, but that you pretty quickly learned like I wasn't going to get the full impact and benefit of that without hiring an implementer at the time. So I used EOS for a couple of years, saw the impact of that, and really it was helpful in kind of our kind of journey in building the business. And my implementer at the time, kind of after a couple of years, moved from EOS to Pinnacle. So that's what we moved with him to implement Pinnacle, and really kind of thought about that as taking our business and our team to kind of to the next level. And so, did that, and, built, a successful business that was commanding a lot of interest from private equity and strategics. Made the decision to kind of lock in some of that value, sold a majority of the business, running it for a couple of years. And I had just become so passionate about, introducing operating systems to other entrepreneurs, and kind of in the seat that I was in, that, I thought this might be a really fun, interesting thing to work on with other CEOs and entrepreneurs like myself. And that's kind of what brought me to do what I do now. I'm a certified Pinnacle business guide. I help leadership teams implement the Pinnacle business operating system, really think about it as a way to clarify where are we trying to go, what's our vision, our strategy, but more importantly, how do we translate that vision into execution? How are we going to go do that? How are we going to execute upon it? How are we going to break through the inevitable ceilings that we're going to hit in order to, grow faster, increase profitability, build enterprise value, and just like have more fun being a CEO, operator, entrepreneur, and kind of doing what's in your unique ability and your zone of genius. So that's kind of the kind of quick story of how I got to be doing what I'm doing now, and having a blast doing it.
Yeah, and that's fantastic. I mean, who better to be implementing these operating systems than someone who's done a few of them at your own business, right? So I think that's critical, to have that kind of firsthand experience. Maybe for folks, who are listening who don't have really any familiarity at all with business operating systems, I know you just gave kind of a high level, but maybe you can just give the landscape of what do in general across
Yeah.
all business operating systems, what do you kind of do, and what is the goal, right, for business owners?
Right. Yeah. So the goal is to really kind of say, what is the goal of the business owner? Where are they trying to go? Right. And what's that vision? What's that strategy? What does that look like? What are the values? What's our kind of long-term goal, medium-term goal, 1 year goal, 90? Like what is the plan to go achieve the vision that they're laying out, right? And so, we work with a leadership team to clarify that vision, but then develop a plan to start executing upon it and really kind of bring in the right tool at the right moment that's going to help them on that journey. So think about, people, right? That having the right people in the right seats. How do we assess talent? How do we coach up? How do we get that really dialed in so that we can kind of continue to level up, right? So how do we have a clear and compelling purpose? Where are we trying to go? What's our strategy to get there? What are our values, right? So if we have the right people in the right seats with a clear and compelling purpose, then it's about our playbooks. Like, how do we win? How do we do what we do in a scalable, repeatable way that's, really dialed in? And then it's about how do we make sure that we are performing, right? So how do we know that we're winning? What's the scoreboard look like? What are the most important things or rocks that we need to get done? How do we have the right meeting cadence that are solving issues, capturing opportunities, moving us forward, right? That kind of thing, right? If we do all four of those, we think that should yield profit and increase value in the business, but we have some things to think about. How do we optimize for that? And so that's kind of the things that we're doing to build. I'm bringing in the right tool at the right moment to kind of be strengthening each of those areas to be helping a leadership team execute upon their vision. And really kind of, I'm think about it like I'm meeting with the leadership team every 90 days or so, kind of in person, facilitating a session to kind of work on each of those things with some touch points in between in order to kind of keep executing on that. So it's really about identifying the vision. How are we going to execute on it? How do we kind of keep leveling up in the process of doing that?
Yeah, that's good. That's helpful. I think, the way when folks have asked me, what do you mean when you say business operating system? I usually try to sum it up by saying you take the highest level kind of strategic vision or goals, like you said, and you ultimately boil that all the way down into, consistent, repeatable playbooks or processes that are written down and that can be monitored and executed on week over week, quarter over quarter.
Absolutely.
So it's really taking that high level and translating it into a day to day cadence with the team.
Absolutely.
You mentioned you started out, you read Traction, which is kind of the book on EOS. You started out implementing it on your own, but then you hired an implementer. I guess what else did you learn other than that it's critical to have a guide or an implementer? What else did you learn during the process of attempting to implement, a business operating system?
Yeah, that's a good question. And to kind of underline on the part there of hiring an implementer, why, we decided to do that. And that was, a big investment for us at the time. And what I found through that was, look, I think there's a lot of folks who are in entrepreneur seats that are, super smart. They can read a book, they can think about that, get really interested. But it's hard to kind of wear multiple hats when you're trying to facilitate a session, when you're trying to bring, to kind of bring the words of a book like Traction or Scaling Up or other books out there to really kind of make it work in the real world with real human beings. And so to kind of wear all those different hats and then also be, in the CEO seat as well was really, really challenging to do. So by hiring an implementer, coach, a guide, what that allowed me to do was like be in the room, in my seat, in my role, on the same side of the table with my leadership team, be in the trenches with them and be focused on that and kind of what the business and team needed from me in that capacity. And then I think it also, we had obviously a subject matter expert to kind of bring in, the expert kind of opinion on how do we, use these tools and the framework to get the most value from it. And also like, what are we learning? What is that person learning from other, clients that they work with? They're bringing an outside perspective and seeing blind spots that, when you're so in the weeds and so in the kind of in the trenches that you might miss. Lastly, I think too, oftentimes I think, left to my own devices, I may, not make the people decision that I needed to make or, not really kind of said differently, like kind of encouraged us to run to the danger a little bit on what was that decision or that obstacle that we had to overcome in order to break through. So I think, we were able to kind of, we were growing very quickly and we were able to kind of break through those ceilings faster by having, not just the system in place, but, a guide, an implementer, a coach to help us really kind of run to the danger and bring that right tool at the right moment.
Got it. So, you know, having an outside perspective, having the accountability kind of from the third party, the guide, and then I would imagine having just the expertise of implementing and seeing these systems across
Absolutely.
many different businesses. Those kind of three things all are critical from an implementer, and I guess the learnings that you're saying is it's hard. You can't get those things by doing it yourself, right? Because you don't have them. So that's a good call out. And then if you think about, while you were implementing or trying to implement EOS and before you had a system in place versus afterwards, what are kind of the biggest three changes you saw, happen to the business and to you, right, as a leader of the business?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a good question. So I think, one thing is I think before having a system, I was really kind of a mad scientist in a lot of ways, right? So I was bringing in concepts from this book or that book or this CEO that I worked for and something that I, worked well or whatever. And I was kind of bringing in a little bit of the, mad scientist kind of concoction or, flavor of the moment or whatever, and kind of giving my team whiplash or confusing them a bit, right? So I think, by having kind of one system that we went all in on, it gave a lot of clarity of focus of, here's where we're trying to go, here's how we're going to get there, here's the tool that's going to help us, overcome each obstacle or kind of increase accountability in the organization. So I think that was a big thing. Let's see, the, kind of second thing I would think about, just how important people are. Like, we say it really all starts with people. And so I think, it gave us a really good way to say, here's where we're trying to go. Like, is that something you want to be a part of? Here's how the part that you're going to play in executing upon it. Here's how we kind of level up people. Here's how we coach them. Here's how we kind of each get stronger and better in the roles that we need to, and really have clarity of what we're trying to achieve and make sure that people are aligned with the kind of strategy, our values, where we're trying to go. And I think so that was a really big component for us. And I think so much of the success or failure of business is people, right? And so I think having a really good way to kind of develop that was super helpful to us. And then, I think if I had to pick a third thing, I think it really made us a more valuable business. We were growing fast. That's certainly great and all, but it kind of made the business less reliant on me because we had a playbook, we had a team, we had a vision for where we were trying to go. Right. So I think as we were kind of thinking about positioning ourselves in the marketplace, we were seen as really a platform investment. When we were still fairly early on or still fairly young for what that could look like and could mean, because we were doing the things that really you know, made a platform. We had a vision, we had a team. Business wasn't relying on me as much. We had a platform, playbooks, right? So all these kind of things that really can contribute to enterprise value. We saw that matriculate as we were building the business.
Yeah, I would say the enterprise value improvement or kind of the platform readiness is a byproduct of the other three things you mentioned, right? I mean, the
Exactly.
first one is so key. Well, the way I would summarize if I'm understanding everything you said correctly, is it forces focus because everything kind of ties back to the first principles concept of your vision or your purpose, right? So if something's not aligned with that purpose, that's easy. But that also trickles all the way up and down the chain of everything you've mentioned, because everything is built based on the purpose and then based on the processes and the playbooks and rocks and everything you define along the way, right? So the focus is huge, having those tools to implement the focus. The second piece, creating a framework to make pretty challenging people related decisions, both hiring and letting people go, whatever that might be on the spectrum. Having a framework to do that consistently is huge, to your point, because if you've got the focus, now you need to be able to execute. And a lot of that execution at the leadership level is getting the right people in the right seats, right? So that's a great point. And then finally, reducing that key person risk. It's something we talk about a ton, on the podcast and also just in general when we're looking at investment opportunities. Every business has some degree of key person risk, but the more that's mitigated through a good leadership team with institutional knowledge rather than, uh, knowledge at any individual or gatekeepers or things of that nature, that's absolutely going to increase enterprise value. So 3 great points there and huge value propositions of a business operating system.
I think like, look, every business owner is like dealing with just like so many fires, right? There's fires happening all the time.
Always.
And so I think, also like as you're talking, like it's a good filter to know like, okay, what are the fires that are going to burn the house down that we absolutely have to deal with and put out? And then maybe create the fire prevention system so that it doesn't happen again. Or like, what are the fires that like I don't need to be concerned with? They're just going to smolder out on their own. Or like, what are the fires that like someone else can handle and be fine with? Like it's totally fine for someone else to run with. I don't need to be on that fire. So I think like it's really good, a really good filter. And then also just really trying to like simplify what may seem and feel complex is really something that a system and a coach can help you do, because you're dealing with as an entrepreneur, you're just dealing with so much complexity or what you perceive to be complexity. And if as much as you can simplify that complexity, it makes it a lot easier for your team to execute.
Yeah, certainly. And the flip side of fires too is opportunities, right? I mean, how many opportunities come across, a business owner or any leadership team member's plate every day and needing to say no to things that aren't aligned with your goals or the purpose.
Yeah, great
It's a
point.
lot easier to say no when you can say, you know, I don't know how this increases my service hours and that's my number, right? So that that's pretty straightforward. Great. Very very good kind of takeaways I think on that front. If you flip the perspective a bit, we've talked a good bit about you implementing business operating systems at your own business, but when you think about, your clients,
Mhm.
where are some areas where you've seen, the most impact or the biggest delta? Maybe this is a couple stories or a few examples of, before and afters on where, implementing a business operating system has really been a game changer for them. And maybe it's one of the 3 things we just talked about, right? Focus, people, or reducing key person risks.
Yeah, I think there's a couple consistent themes or buckets that I see with clients and kind of where this can be helpful. One of the first clients that I started working with, about a very small, not very small, but a smaller business, in what would be considered kind of a sleepier industry. And to that point, like there was no leadership team. Everything kind of went through the prior owner, right? And it was kind of command and control, literally no leadership team, right? And this entrepreneur saw a clear opportunity to kind of build something beyond that, right? Like it had reached there or a ceiling of where that business could go to that point with kind of that structure. And that prior owner had done a good job getting it to there, right? And kind of build value in doing that, right? There's nothing wrong with that. That worked for that person's lifestyle and what they were trying to achieve. And it was ready to kind of go beyond that, right? And so that's where this, kind of younger, hungrier, super talented, entrepreneur came in and bought the business. And, by working with me and getting the Pinnacle system in place, right, kind of built a leadership team, gave real role clarity of like, hey, we're trying to do something different that, is not what the prior kind of owner was looking to do. It's really kind of a reset of the vision of the business and what are the roles that we need to do to have in order to kind of get there, right? So creating that leadership team, giving real role clarity, resetting the vision. And so this past year, I think they grew over 40% in, both revenue and EBITDA, right? And so, that's not an uncommon, kind of thing to see is that level of kind of growth with when you're kind of resetting and you're trying to, kind of really try to kind of get to where a new vision for where you're trying to go. So that's kind of like one, type of situation I see all the time. Another one is, maybe a bit larger of a business and they're starting to do acquisitions or want to do acquisitions, right? And so you're bringing together, multiple businesses or multiple leadership teams trying to have one kind of, one platform or one one kind of vision that you're working towards, and really making sure that those businesses that you're acquiring and integrating can function, can integrate well, so that you, as maybe the growth focused visionary or whatever role you have, can continue to do that. And so if the base business is working well, continue to focus on growth, whether that be organic or inorganic growth. So, I have a couple clients that kind of fall into that bucket of, it was, did a bunch of acquisitions. There were, or maybe a few acquisitions, disparate leadership teams, kind of different structures, different focus, different values, different, all that kind of stuff, really kind of creating that one cohesive vision, leadership team in order to execute. And then also kind of, have the right structure and roles in order to, have, be continuing to do that, right? Whether to be able to continue to focus on growth. So I see those kind of, those are kind of two types of archetypes or stories that I see just all the time, where it could be pretty helpful. And then maybe a third one is, you're just running into some kind of obstacle where you need to kind of be able to solve that obstacle before you can really continue to grow. And so, one that I think of there is, super talented founder who had built a business, but was kind of himself was kind of sitting in all the seats. And, as we started to kind of draw that out, it's like, oh my God, I need to think about, how do I get out of some of those seats? What's the process to do that? Do I need to hire, what are the kind of prereqs before we hire that person? Do we need to get the process in place? Or do we need, what are the things that are going to have to, do in order to kind of free myself up from sitting in all those seats, so that I can focus on my unique ability in order to build the business. So I guess those are the kind of three things that I see quite a lot with clients.
Those are helpful. I want to unpack the first one a little bit, and I think the first and the third have similarities, or kind of common themes across them. So in the first example you suggested, an individual bought a business, and business didn't have any leadership team. It was all kind of just sheer willpower of the owner that got it to where it was. So the outcome was, after you supported them, implemented Pinnacle, they brought on a leadership team. Can you unpack a little bit, like, what were some of the steps you guys took to get there? I mean, I imagine talk a lot about purpose and defining the goals and things like that. So can you walk us through what you did and what kind of groundwork you laid before actually getting that leadership team in place? Because that sounds like a great outcome and a fantastic, 40% growth story. So
Yeah, absolutely. And that's just in the year. It's kind of more than that since we've started working together, but I think it's probably over 60% there. But yeah, so what we thought about in that kind of situation was, you're really starting with purpose first, right? So we have a tool called our strategic vision execution plan. And so, or SVEP is what we call it. And that's kind of really trying to get that vision and strategy dialed into like a front and back of a paper, to really clarify, what are our values, like what's important to us, why do we exist? What's our long-term big, hairy, audacious goal, or we call our one pinnacle? What do we want the business to look like in 3 years? What do we want to look like in 1 year? What are the goals there? And what are the rocks? So really trying to get that in. What's our flywheel, right? What are the things that if we do consistently well, we're going to create sustainable momentum in the business, right? What are the promises we're making as a brand in the marketplace? So really kind of getting all of that really dialed in. I think that was a really good way to say, all right, the past is the past that brought us to where we are today, which is great. Now, like, thinking about, okay, it's going to take something different to get to where we're trying to go, right? And so as we kind of laid that out, we said, all right, what are the seats that need to exist in the organization? And, at a point in time, an owner may sit in multiple seats. That's okay for a certain point, but you want to be working towards aligning your seat to be, where you're best suited of highest use and your unique ability. But we said, okay, based on where we're trying to go, our strategy, our vision, here are the seats that need to exist. So kind of, really created that leadership team, mostly from people within the organization, but really clarified, here's the seat I'm in, right? And what I own, what I'm obsessing over, the KPIs that I'm really trying to impact, how it ties to the success of the business, really trying to get that dialed in. And then the kind of third there is saying, okay, what are the things that we have, the kind of building block things that we just have to do and execute upon in order to kind of get us moving towards that, right? And so those are kind of like three of the things that we think about, and making sure everyone in the organization understands it, understands what their role is, how it ties to the success of the business, being as transparent as possible in that, so that people can say, all right, am I in on for that? Or there may be some folks who are, not going to want to be on that bus, right? And are not right people for that. And so, trying to kind of, continue to have the right people in the right seats as you lay that strategy out.
yeah, so that's really important groundwork, right? You kind of I imagine you're working one-on-one or, similar with the owner,
Yes.
this new business owner to define the purpose, the big goals and all that stuff. And then you're working with them to define, okay, what are the seats and who are the right people for those seats. And then, it's on them. You've kind of shown them the door. It's on them to kind of put those people in the seats, coach them through that and get buy-in. But then what comes after that, right? Because then that's where the whole, you know, cadence and consistent system of the business operating system comes into play. So I imagine the 40% growth in 1 year didn't simply come because those leadership individuals, were handed a new job description, right? There was a lot more that came after that. And maybe you can talk a little bit about, what occurred after that, is critical to actually ensuring great outcomes like the one in this story.
Right. Yeah. And I think, this really gets to the kind of our 5 Ps that I talked about earlier. It's kind of in the performance section, right? So this is about like, okay, how do we have the right structure from a meeting perspective to know that, like, have a pulse on the business, ensure accountability, instill trust, and be solving the issues, week in, week out, right? So having a really tight agenda for that, and kind of a way to know, like, objectively, like, are we on track or off track? Are we making progress? If not, like, what are we doing? What do we have to do to kind of solve for that, or capture opportunities? So I think that's a really big part of how do you make sure that, you're translating the vision, the strategy. That's, in my opinion, actually like the easy part. I think the hardest part is like what you're talking about right now is how do you show that or consistently execute upon that, have trust that it's going to happen and work consistently. And, I think back to my kind of operating days, like the times when I was jumping in or I was most stressed or things like, I think it was usually, or micromanaging, right? It was when I didn't have trust and I didn't know that like something was going to happen to the level that I wanted it to. And I think that's where having the right meeting structure and cadence in place is important. What's right, the right scoreboard, right? So I didn't have to ask or question if something was happening. You could see it on the scoreboard, right? And so when you kind of get that type of thing in place and working well, it allows you as the owner to kind of like sit back a little bit more and kind of breathe, exhale a little bit because you have a way to know like, all right, is this working or not? Is there smoke before there's fire? Kind of like the analogy we were using before of, do I need to have attention here, or is it things are working? They got it. I'm okay there. I trust that it's happening. So I think that kind of accountability and having the right scoreboard in place to know where are we on or off track is just so important.
Right. Okay. That's great. So it's to kind of recap those three phases within this specific example and probably applicable to a lot of the examples you see, but you start with the strategic, the vision, purpose, goals, that stuff. You work with the owner to translate that into the seats and the right people.
Mhm.
You then take, you get the owner gets buy-in from those people and you work with that whole team, maybe more closely with the owner to create a meeting cadence where, you know, and to define KPIs that each, leadership team member needs to execute on and report on during those meetings. And that's really kind of the, in the simplest format for folks that aren't as familiar with systems, how a company benefits most from, business operating system and how it really drives value because you've taken now a high level vision and goals and translated it into week over week, quarter over quarter KPIs that the leadership team needs to execute on. Makes a ton of sense. And it, it's, for me, it's pretty easy to understand why doing something like that when it didn't exist before can drive outcomes like 40% year over year growth, right? Just like the things you said, you've got better focus, you've got the right team in place, you've got frameworks for making sure the right team is in place and making those hard people decisions. It simplifies all the um, as you put it, kind of takes the mad scientist out of it and makes you more into, a lab scientist or something of that nature. So that's fantastic. One thing that you and I have talked about a bit and I wanted to bring to this conversation, expand on is, and we can use this same example, when someone's looking at a business thinking about buying it, or maybe an investor is thinking about backing a searcher, how can they, what kind of simple questions or information can they look at to assess whether or not this business is ready for Pinnacle or any kind of business operating system implementation in the near term, or whether that's kind of a further out initiative? And I kind of delineate between the two because we always say there's this sort of stabilization period that often occurs, especially if there's a, CEO transition, and like there is in the typical search deal. It's pretty hard to, go right in and start defining a vision and doing all that stuff when you don't even fully understand the business. So, what would you suggest folks look at to assess how quickly someone might be able to jump in and implement a business operating system?
Yeah, and I think even thinking about like, should I buy this business or not too? I think, kind of thinking about that a little bit too is like, you know, one is like, what's the game that you're trying to win, right? And like, what's the kind of obstacle or ceiling or barrier that like you're gonna have to solve for in order to kind of get to where you want to get. Like I think about thinking about those two things. Like is this an execution game? Is it a speed game? Is it a what's the game that I'm trying to win? And then like what's the barrier that I have to overcome in order to really kind of unlock that value? I think that's something to be thinking about, both when you're purchasing the business, but also like as you're thinking about, okay, how can Pinnacle or another operating system or whatever tool or system or anything, how is it going to help me in that, right? And so, I think about when you think about like trying to be ready for, okay, if this system going to be helpful in that journey, right? You're trying to build something special, you're trying to grow, you're trying to increase value, you're trying to really build something awesome. Like I think you want to be thinking about the people on the team, right? Like, is this something where, in yourself too, as an owner, as a CEO, like, are you able to be coachable, right? Like, is this something where you see the value in, expert, guidance or tools that have worked for others in the past, and like you can be ready to kind of, take some of that in and apply it. Because if you're not, you're not going to get the full value of something like that. So you need to kind of be ready to go all in on something and kind of do less of the mad scientist like I talked about, and really kind of have the discipline, the focus, the simplifying what could be complex, and commit to that. So I think that's kind of one thing like within your own self of like, are you ready to do that? I think the other thing is, you know, you do want to have learn about the business enough where you feel like, okay, I understand what are the main levers what's the game I'm trying to win, what's the barrier or the obstacle that I'm trying to overcome. Like, I think those are important things that you want to be kind of getting your arms around so that you can start executing. I do think like, you know, many times we, as entrepreneurs, like, will kind of try to get things perfect rather than good, and that kind of slows us down and delays us. So I think I've seen more often than not, like getting going actually will help get you there faster, right? And so you can iterate on getting the exact strategy in place, or you'll learn kind of how to maybe iterate on what does that exact seat need to look like. But if you get going on it, you're going to get that momentum going faster so that you can be executing faster. So I think more often than not, actually, people probably wait too long to implement an operating system in order to kind of get some of that, some of that kind of low hanging fruit, some of the momentum going faster if you're able to kind of implement sooner. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it does, and it's an important call out, right? That if you operate too long in kind of this unknown territory where you haven't taken the time and effort to define the high level and translate that all the way down to execution, you risk some of the things we talked about earlier, which is lack of focus, no framework for making hires and letting folks go. And you start potentially doing what the prior owner may have done, which is building a business around that's dependent on you as the new owner. Right. So yeah, that's spot on. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, speed is, I think, so important in kind of the SMB world in general, right? And is a kind of a differentiating factor for so many SMBs, right? So I think that to the extent that you can decide quickly, but then act quickly on it too, is really a kind of an unfair advantage that you have over competitors. And I think this applies here too.
Yeah, and I do really like, the way you're talking about what folks should look at and think about during the diligence process. It's a lot more proactive than, what I think some kind of more traditional diligence approaches look like, right? Instead of simply reviewing, all the information you have, you can get access to through the lens of what are the risks of the business today, and I want to make sure I know exactly what I'm buying today. You're talking a lot about things that relate to, hey, now I understand, obstacles, and I understand what we have in place. How can I start planning, for day one and for day 90 and for, year one and year three and things like that, right? So we're big proponents of a much more proactive approach during the diligence process. And I think having the mindset of, a business operating system is an option and it's something that I most likely want to do post close gives buyers and potentially even investors, a much better framework for thinking about what they should be looking at during the diligence process. So
Absolutely.
all very good. Well, look, Anthony, any closing thoughts you have for us or any kind of thing you want to share on how folks can get in touch with you?
Yeah, look, I think I just want to kind of highlight that really like entrepreneurs are the heroes in this story, right? And anything that I can do, others can do, like to support that journey is, I think, just so impactful. The value that entrepreneurs create, the good that they can do in the world and their industries, their communities, their teams, their families, like it's just so cool that impact that people are able to have. So, there are lots of tools and resources out there. I think it's about figure out, what's going to work for you and resonate with you. But I want to definitely see those stories continue to succeed. And look, I'll say something controversial on an S&P investor, podcast, but not all capital is a commodity, right? I won't say that. Like, there's definitely some, folks like yourself who are absolutely value add, capital partners. But in the kind of grand scheme of things, right? Like, capital can be a commodity, right? And so it's really the entrepreneur that's the hero that's putting in the kind of proverbial blood, sweat, and tears to create something really, really awesome. And so I think there's lots of resources to help you in that journey. For myself, to contact me, my email is anthony@higherpeak.co. You can find me on that website. I've also kind of created a higherpeak.co/SMB investor landing page where if you want a free copy of the Peak Performance Pinnacle book, happy to mail you one. There's also an audio version that I'm happy to make available as well, or schedule a call to kind of walk through this together. So those are the kind of the ways that you can find me.
It's fantastic. Well, Anthony, thanks again for joining, and look forward to hopefully getting some Pinnacle business systems implemented with our portfolio as well.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. I appreciate that.
All right. Have a good one.
Thanks.